What can I do? Pin up a piece of fabric?
Let me see.
What? Did it start?
Yeah, you're on there.
Is it recording?
Oh!
If it says recording, is it recording? Okay, I'm gonna try to cover up the windows a little bit because it's so bright.
I'm following you.
No,
It's so easy.
I have pants on. This is the first time I haven't had shorts.
I don't.
What do you think? If I stick this up there, will that help?
Yeah.
I'm gonna stand on the table for a little bit. Where's the little? Hello, everybody. We're getting ready. Are you still following me?
No.
I even combed my hair this morning. This is like an extra,
You have jeans
extra
on.
special day.
Okay, I'll follow Rick instead. Hi, Rick.
Tell everybody what you're doing. I'm making a fun skirt for a Nutcracker lady. It's Nutcracker season.
Give us some real entertainment. Do some stand-up or something.
I told you I'm not a funny person.
A dance. He dances. I've seen him in the club.
I can do Irish dance.
Yeah, why aren't we
Do it,
reliving this time of your life? Rick was a professional Irish dancer in the professional circuit.
That is an Italian right there.
I don't think I can get up
He
there.
cooks some good spaghetti and meatballs.
But I can't.
This is tragic.
I want to block the window, but
That does nothing. It's like a shear.
well, how could I make it better? It's because
I
it's
think we're fine.
Yeah,
Like,
we're gonna
it's
be
not
all right.
shining at the table. It's just over there.
okay. It's not too bright.
No.
Well, never mind then.
Travis, Maxine says you're supposed to be thinking of work health and safety.
Never. I haven't put up my OSHA poster.
Yeah, people say it looks good. Not too bright on the table.
It's not too bright, not down here. No, we're good. I got the back of your neck. Rachel's making a pink bodice. It's gorgeous. Okay. We'll give everybody a couple more minutes. You're right. Keep it on Rick. What? It's just now 3:30. How many people?
329.
Oh,
There
we've
might be
got
some
like
more people.
10 more people.
Show that bodice.
Everybody that signed up today, if you haven't taken Bodice 1, you will. Isn't that pretty? It's a sugar plum bodice. Should we put it with the tutu? Anybody that signed up today, I'll email you tomorrow to get your password. Oh my.
I felt inspired because it's pink and purple.
You don't mention that pink stuff. Oh, here.
Look at this
Show the whole thing. Just double careful. Show it. Does it all show?
Yeah, back up.
Oh, that's so pretty. You know, just 10,000 pieces and you can't go wrong. That's a work of art. So excited to see what you make for her hair. Something simple.
It is the Imperial bodice for people who are asking.
Yes, that's our favorite one. Right now.
I'm ready for a new pattern.
Me too. After Christmas.
After 26 of them. But I like it.
There's 3 more, the Merlotons.
I'm not
29, how many? There'll be 29 altogether. Where's my water? Okay.
You didn't know you were on camera?
I didn't know I was. Let me check my Instagram. If this is your first time, we goof around for a few minutes until more people have shown up. Did more people show up?
No, it's the same. But it's only 3:31.
Oh, my clock, the clock on the wall is fast. I feel like I should cover that man.
Someone asked about putting stuff on the two-tier. There's not like a formula to where things are placed on there. It's just you put things on so that it looks balanced, I guess. Like, it's not measured out with different appliques in certain places. And then it's denser toward the inside. So it looks darker.
That's Is it rip nice and straight?
Yeah.
Oh, good.
It's just not on the gold. Not on the gold.
Across it.
Yeah.
And
Like down.
which way do the stripes go?
Up and down.
So you should keep big wide pieces.
Yeah. Well, no, this isn't for a ruffle. This was just the yard.
The sample. Oh,
Yeah.
to save. I get it.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, perfect. Then do the stripes go a beneficial way or a non-beneficial way for the rest? A beneficial way. Yeah. Oh, wow. That's great. Yeah. So you'll have big long pieces.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh no, they don't. They go really short. Oh, this is like.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'll show them what you're doing. Whoa. This is just a sample, but it's fun. Rick's making a tiered dress that has 5 tiers of this polycrapulon striped organza edged with fur. But what's fun is he's going to take yards and yards of rectangles and then dart them together to turn the straight stripes into circular flounces. So on the skirt, all her stripes will run up and down, but it'll actually be a full flounce. So the hem of each of the 5 tiers will be super full with fur, but it'll lay absolutely flat at the top of each tier. So that's going to be really cool. You know, make the fabric do impressive things for you. How many we got now? Almost everybody? I hope she twirls a lot.
Should be furniture.
Yeah, right? She'll probably roll on the floor. That's what always happens with the gorgeous costume. And then she rolls on the floor.
People are like, they said polycrapulon.
That's the technical term.
We do have some questions from the last class.
Yes, let's do those first.
And it looks like we've gotten the right number. It hasn't changed.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
I know at least 4 people that are just getting the recording.
Okay. When you base the lining onto the fabric on the stitching line, do you remove the basting stitches later or leave them?
We leave it. In all the big shops, it's common to leave it because you want to see where it originally was. And nobody is going to see that stitching from a distance. And it will make your costume last long.
Um,
I'm ripping some pieces.
Yeah, and then you're going to talk about bone placement today, right?
Yeah, we're going to talk about that, and then we're going to talk about, we call it the Moscow scrunch, how to make fashion pieces that are stretched like a drum. And then I'm going to show you some of the shops in New York still do, and we do, depending on the project, where you quilt onto the cotillion like a satin or something thin and silky to make the bodices last a super duper long time. And especially you can quilt at the neck and in the back. It's something that I wouldn't recommend doing for every bodice because it's very, very time consuming. But if you're making a sugar plum that you want to last 30 years, it's a good thing to do. And also, if you don't want to use cotillo, but you're interested in this quilting process, you can use a thin twill and then a very thin, good quality like satin, and quilt it together to give you the strength and longevity of cotillo without the thickness, and you're using 2 layers so it gets thick again. And I'm also going to show how you can quilt a back or a front with satin and then cut out the cotillo inside the seam allowance so that you're not adding extra thickness on the inside when your seams fold inside out. So I'm going to show you the sleeve from the Regal pattern, and we're going to show you kind of how we deal with hips too, and just kind of the basic approach that we use when we're changing the size of a bodice. We're lucky here that we all just make a pattern for whatever size human we've got. But if you need to adjust patterns, I'm going to show you kind of the ideas behind adjusting stuff. And I'm going to go get a brand new juicy Sharpie, and then we'll start.
You have one more question.
Yeah.
How do you add cording to the back of a bodice to tighten the back?
We don't do that. Are you talking about where you add elastic cording? It would be the same as when you make your back. I think that's the question that they're asking. Do I have a back? So let me get elastic cording too. I have juicy Sharpie. We'll just start with something right there. And some solamine. How about orange? We never use the orange.
Oh, that rusty one?
Yeah, the rusty. And the juicy.
I wish it had more colors.
You need some rusty
I want
orange.
pink.
They don't make it.
I know, I wish they would.
Okay, so let's talk just for a smidge about elastic in the back. You can get, let me get it to you. Okay, now we'll start. This is a good time. Oh good, we got 2 more people. So you can also, in your fronts and back of your bodice, this is elastic cording, which we also get from Whack Sewing, and it has no information on it, but you could just order their elastic cording and guess what size it is. You can use that in place of the cotton piping in the back. Then at your center back, you can actually leave the cording exposed so that you can pull it and tighten that back edge up a little bit. So like on this bodice, that from the side, it scoops up for the strap and then back down. You wouldn't want to cord this section, or if you corded this whole thing, what you would do is stitch over the cording at the peak so that you can adjust it at the side to take in your side a little bit, or so that you can adjust it at the back to scrunch in your back a little bit. We usually make pretty darn fitted hammered things that by hammered I mean it's going to fit one person, or it's going to fit within a slight difference of that size, and we don't have to elastic the back. It's more common if you're making a bunch of different sizes. Or I do think a lot of people end up wanting to put the elastic cording in the back because they haven't tried the cotton cording often. Like if you're not using the elastic to get more sizes out of it, what's happening is in your bodice you've got this cut across the bias and the back grows and grows and grows. So by us putting the cotton cording in, it keeps the back from growing. But let me just show you another thing that you can do. With the same stitch that we did at the end of bodice 1, a lot of times you'll see in historic bodices or professional bodices that are used in a big company. So we would do this often at the Joffrey and at Houston. Is we would cross stitch the piping down first. Then you can take an elastic and lay an elastic where you want a little bit of snug in, and you can anchor that elastic to your piping. So I'm just, or to my piping, to the bias of my piping, so you can anchor a piece of elastic in there. So this is just this is in place of if you don't have the elastic cording. Or if you have a bodice for 2 girls and it fits one girl really well and the other girl it's gappy, so I've anchored my piece of elastic in there. And then I'm going to do the herringbone stitch right over the edge of that. And we put up a picture of that on the students page, a close-up of that. Then it gives you something to tighten. Like, I know when I was a little kid, all my pants had the buttonhole elastic in it and buttons at the side, so that you'd start with pants that are too big on a little kid and then let the button out. Did you have those? Did girls have those? Oh, all my clothes had that growing up. So then what I've done is I cross-stitched over this elastic. Then I can pull this elastic, right, and I can anchor it down. And even though it makes a scrunchy mess right now, that on the back of a girl will just keep that, it'll keep the gap out of her back. So this is just cross-stitching over a piece of elastic and pulling it. You know, you have to decide kind of how much to pull it, but that'll help keep it up against her back too. And especially as ballerinas, you know, or ballerinaing around, if you're getting gaps in the front and back in certain positions of their body, try doing this or using the elastic cording. It's a good thing. So let us look first at just some modifications that you can do to a basic pattern, because that always comes up, and it's good to look at this. So we're going to be all over the place today, but we're going to just show you things to add to your toolbox rather than just trying to race through and make a bodice. And for the bodice pieces we are going to make, I picked some lurid fabrics that show up good on the camera.
They're not bad.
They're not bad. I did okay. At first I had a really bad time. So let's look. For today, I'm going to mess with the regal pattern, and we are going to look just at the pattern pieces we've got first, and then I'm going to look at the size that it makes. And I'm not worrying about the center front because I showed you the way we like to treat the center front on there. Now, somebody did email after Bodice 1 and say, why don't you make the center front just out of stretch mesh? I find when we're making a structured bodice, if we make this front out of just the stretch mesh, no matter how much you fit it at the side, if this isn't stretchy, this piece just keeps torquing and torquing and torquing, and then you end up with a weird, kind of a weird fit over the bust. So we don't do that. We make a structured front. But that's why. Somebody wanted to know why. So that's why. So I'm going to look at my pattern here. And the size C, so I've cut the tall, large one, the size C, and my bust is 32, and my waist is 26, and my back neck to waist is 15.5. So I'm going to say my back neck to waist is good because we dealt with that last time. So my bust is 32.5, and my waist is 26. Let's look at a couple things that you can do to easily change the bust or waist. So the first scenario I'm going to kind of just ramble through is that the bust is a good size and the waist of this pattern is too big. I'm going to say that my waist, that I actually want a waist of 24 inches. So my waist is 2 inches too big for my whole pattern. Then let's remember that we only have half the pattern, so I'm going to take away an inch. I want to subtract an inch from just the waist of my pattern. So if you have what I call a small adjustment, like 1 inch to 1.5 inches per side, you can probably do it in 2 locations, and we usually pick the side seams because that's an easy place. Now, let's say you had to take 2 inches out of each side, out of the right half of her body and the left half of her body, to make the waist, like, let's say we were going to make the waist 4 inches smaller. So this pattern has the waist marked. If I wanted to make the whole waist 4 inches smaller, that means I'm taking away 2 inches from each side. And if you start just chopping it off just at the side seams, you're going to start getting their nipples in a weird place, and you're going to start getting weird gaps in the back. So if the adjustment per side, per half, is more than an inch, do it in 4 places instead of just in 2 places. So maybe I should change my scenario. Let's say that this is actually makes a 26-inch waist, and we want a 22-inch waist. So I'm going to get rid of 2 inches at each side, but the bust is okay. So the first thing I like to do is kind of lay my pattern out. And even though it's not like clearly marked where her nipple is, you can kind of guess by looking at it. You know, clearly it's above the waist and below the neck. So I'm going to just kind of pencil on, I'm going to dot on where I think her bust point is. And from there up, I'm going to say my pattern fits, so I don't want to take anything away. But from there down, it doesn't fit, and I need to adjust stuff. So in this scenario, I'm going to say we're going to take 2 inches out of half of it, right? You're going to have to rewind and listen to this. So instead of taking an inch out of each side seam, I'm going to take a half of an inch out of 4 locations. So you can look at the seams you've got. So I have a side back to a back. So if I take away a half an inch from this intersection, I've got my waist drawn. And I'm going to take away a 1/4 from each side of that seam. And then I'm going to look at my front, and I'm going to say, well, the back I took a 1/4 on each side of a single seam. My front has more seams to it. So I want to take also a half away from the front, but some from both of these seams. So hopefully that makes sense. So instead of taking a 1/4 and a 1/4, I might take away a smidge less than a 1/4 here, a smidge less than a 1/4 there, and then even though this seam is itty-bitty, I might take away just a little bit from that, so that collectively I've taken away a half and a half. And then at my sides, I'm also going to mark a half. So the side seam is easy. So I'm going to just blend that up to where my bust fits. So at the sides, if I take away a half and a half, that's gotten rid of an inch out of our 2-inch scenario where we're taking 2 inches out of the waist. Then I know where my bust is. I'm going to take a curved ruler, and I'm going to grab a curved ruler. I didn't clean up, but somebody cleaned up for me. Then I don't want to take this other waist adjustment out all the way to the bust. I want to stop below the bust. So I'm going to just slim in where the ruler lays really nice. And I'm going to kind of blend this whole adjustment together. But what I want to show you is that, like, the more you have to reduce or enlarge to do it in more than one location. And I generally tell people if the adjustment is more than an inch to do it in more than 2 spots. So then I can go, oh, and I've got my adjustment back here too. So now, at least if I've done something not quite right, I've kind of split the difference between a few places. And I'm going to curve it back out, because in this scenario, I'm going to say that her hip actually is the right size. We just wanted to slim in her waist. Then you just cut that off. And then we're going to talk a little bit more here about some basic alterations to the pattern itself. So hopefully everybody gets my slim in the waist approach. And you know, this tiny little piece, you might just say, I don't want to deal with it. Then slim a little bit out on either side of it. Okay, so we've shrunk our waist and we've blended it all together. Get rid of our scraps. Now let me show you another way to shrink the waist. So I'm going to show you yet another way. So we're going to say the bust is the same. If you've taken our patterning class, you'll hear me talk about split it into a T. So I'm going to show you the idea behind split it into a T. So if I wanted to reduce my side back, to get a more perfect fit or a true fit for the new size, if you split the pieces, instead of dealing with each side of a piece, if you split the piece into an upside down T, now I have, let's just look at this. So we're going to say that my amount of modification is at my side back. So by splitting a piece into an upside down T, you can do two things. You can pivot from the corners of your T to evenly enlarge the waist. So if I needed to gain a ½ an inch for the back, I might split this into a T and add a quarter, and then I would take my center back piece and split it into a T, and then I could gain another quarter. Then you just have to blend the bottom edge of your pieces together, and you haven't really changed your seam lines. So splitting a piece to an upside down T is a way you can enlarge the waist without changing the bust. The other thing about splitting it is you can actually, if you need to reduce the waist, you can overlap the bottom of the piece and reduce the waist. So now I'm getting this hiccup here. I've got this little jog where my bottom doesn't match, but then that's one of those places where you would split the difference. You wouldn't go to the lower line or the higher line. You tape on a new piece of paper and split the difference. Then with this specific pattern, I've got to remember that my hip piece is fitting in here also. So I would cut and take out the same distance out of my hip. Yeah?
Would you do this method to enlarge the bust?
Yes, same thing. Perfect. That's where we're headed next. So everybody gets my shrunk the waist or enlarge the waist ideas. Do it in a couple places, or this fabulous split it into a T. But know when you split something into a T, you're going to have to blend an edge together somewhere. But the upside down T is good for enlarging and reducing. Now let's say on my, I'm going to just chop this whole pattern up. Now let's say on my side front that my waist is the right size, but let's say my whole bust, it needs to be 2 inches bigger, so I need to gain an inch at each side. So I'm going to split a T the other direction. So if I'm growing the bust and leaving the waist, I'm going to slice from the top down, and I'm going to slice across the waist, and then I can enlarge my bust and I can shrink my bust. Now the adjustments you're probably doing are just, you know, 1/4 of an inch here, 1/8 of an inch there. But I find when we're working, especially with a group of costumes, it's better off to try to get stuff a little closer at the beginning. Then you have less headache later on. So that's the basic adding and subtracting. Now let's talk about cup size. So our patterns are very pro-ballerina-y shaped in that they don't have a whole lot of, well, how could you say it? A lot of chest. They're not very busty girls. But I want to show you kind of the idea, and this is more, this kind of goes into pattern grading, but I want to show you the steps to change the cup size of something, and I need a little bit of tape. Do you see what I do with tape? Did I even ever have tape? Thanks, you saved the day. I don't know where mine is. That pink one should be somewhere. So I want to show you kind of like how you change the cup size. And I never run into anybody where they say, we need to shrink the cup size. So I'm going to show you how to enlarge it. So if you need to enlarge the cup, and this is for more than just bodices. This is how to enlarge the cup on anything that's fitted or even non-fitted. So what I've done here is I laid my front all together. So I'm going to tape all the pieces for my front loosely together so that I can show you how to enlarge the cup. So I kind of have my whole front right. So her boob, a larger boob, I don't need anything dealing with the back of the pattern. That's done. We can get rid of that. But the front is where her chest is. And you'll, you can kind of assume that these patterns are an A cup, and this adjustment will take it kind of to a B, and if you double the adjustment, it takes it kind of to a C. But again, when you alter a pattern, mock it up, try it on, and adjust your fit before you just make the most gorgeous sugar plum ever. So to change the cup on this, what I want to do is identify where I think her nipple is in the pattern. And I think it's kind of right there, about 3 inches over from the front. Then you're going to draw a really good line straight across from that point. So I want to enlarge from here across. So when you enlarge the cup, you're giving more room over the meat of the breast. I'm going to draw a boob. Are you ready?
I'm ready for this.
So here's her neck, there's her boob, there's her waist, right? That looks like a boob. So when you're enlarging the cup, you have to think about you need more fabric coming this way towards the chest. But with a larger cup, you also need more fabric the up and down. So like anybody that took pattern drafting will remember when we build our dart in, we're dealing with the difference in the back neck to waist, but we're making the front back neck to waist larger to accommodate the meat here in the front. So I've identified
I don't like being called
the meat, the muscle,
the muscle.
the muscle, the boobs, I know. So the first thing I did is I identified where I think her nipple is. And I'm going to split straight across this whole pattern, almost to the side. So I don't want to completely lose my side. But to enlarge the cup kind of a size from an A to a B, you need another 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch height at the nipple. So I've split this whole thing and I've opened it up like Pac-Man's mouth. And then I'm going to measure where my nipple was. And I'm going to raise that up 3/8 of an inch to where the nipple is. So I haven't changed anything at my side seam, but where her nipple is, I have enlarged it. And I'm going to tape that down to the nipple. Now, this Pac-Man thing that's going on here, right, I've split from the side and I've opened it up, like that. After the nipple, towards the center, I don't want to just keep opening. I want to run it parallel. So now I'm going to just slice up from there and fit this in so that the rest of my pattern will run parallel. So from my side to my nipple, I've increased. And then from my nipple to my center front, it's the nipple day. In the Leo class, I say crotch. Must be. So now I'm going to tape that all together where I'm running parallel. So we've dealt with that we need more height over the breast. Now we need to deal with it. We need just a little more width over the breast. So the nice thing would be is if this had a seam right over her nipple, it will be easier to add circumference around the body. But since it doesn't, I'm going to add, I want to gain about 3/8 of an inch that can give some more fabric over the bust. So I'm going to put 3/8 of an inch, part of it on this side of this seam, part of it on that side of that seam, and even a tiny bit of it on this side of my middle front. And then it's going to blend back in before we get to the waist and the top. So hopefully this is like one of those moments where you're like, I'm so absolutely confused, but I kind of get the idea. Did anybody have it's starting to have kind of a light bulb moment about how we're changing the bust size?
Yes, and we have a question.
Yes.
What about girls who are between children's and women's sizes and have no boobs? Should she enlarge a children's pattern, or what are your suggestions?
You know, I always try to get a pattern that fits the chest, because the waist is the easiest thing to deal with. And it's easier if you have a chest that's too full when you've made it. It's much easier to take to take away than to try to add. So if you think your pattern is a little bit round, I always feel like that's easier for me because I have an easier time taking away the waist. So now you would just tape on a new piece of paper, and kind of at the place where the nipple is, you're going to come in and you're going to just add just a smidge at each of those seams because we need more circumference and more height to change the bust of a pattern. And a really great thing is if you have like a Vogue sewing pattern lying around at home, pull it out that has different sizes and just look and see really where did they add to make what adjustment. You know, a lot of people, I think, when they first start with grading or pattern alteration, they get too carried away, and often people end up with something that's far, far bigger than they actually need. So does anybody have questions about kind of what I did there? Definitely worth sleeping on.
Is it total 3/8 for the seams or at each seam?
It's a total. If I added 3/8 at each seam, my bust will be gigantic. So it's just a little bit. So if I hold this here, you can see that I've just added a little bit. I've taken 3/8, and since my nipple is in the middle of a piece, there's not a seam right there. I've divided 3/8 into 3. So I've added an 1/8 in 3 places, and then I blended my seams back together. So I went above and below the nipple to start and stop what I added.
Is this what they call full bust adjustment in dressmaking?
I think so, but I'm not a dressmaker. Rick, have you heard of that, a full bust adjustment? I'm not a dressmaker, but I make a lot of patterns. I think that if you had a vintage pattern and you knew the bust for like a 40s dress and you need a new one, I think this is what you would do, where you split it towards the side and add vertical room for the bust and add a smidge around. So I think yes. I don't know. Okay, we ready for more? So that's kind of just the adjustment stuff I wanted to show you guys. But I think in the new year we will have our patterning classes again. And anybody who's really getting into a lot of sewing, no matter what you're sewing, a patterning class will give you just a lot of insight on a lot of stuff. It like just opens up all sorts of stuff. Okay, the next thing I want to show you is a quilted bag. So Rick has already cut out my back in cotillo, and he's put my bone casing on it. He stitched the long side of the bone casing first.
We have one question before you start this.
Yeah.
For a C cup, would you double the adjustment?
Yeah, so if I had a really flat bodice, and I think she was a C or had a lot of breast, I would add 3/4 of an inch in height, and I would add 3/4 across in circumference for that boob. Let me give myself a little mammogram. Yeah. But again, mock it up because you'll kind of find like the minutia of you know what you're doing and how it relates to a finished thing. Okay, so I want to show you this cool thing that Barbara Matera did in New York, and we did for the little dancer costumes because it was at the Kennedy Center for several months, and we're hoping it comes to Broadway. And this is a quilted bag, and there's more than one kind of approach to this, but I want to just show you the principle of it. And I'm going to get some tracing paper. So the back is what's going to grow over time. This is going to grow. We showed you that you can use a little piece of twill tape in bodice 1 to keep that back from growing. Another thing is when you think about like your old bodices at the studio where they've worn out, a lot of times it's in the center front or the sides from pulling, and it's in the back. And something that Barbara Matera would do, and so if nobody knows who Barbara Matera is, she ran one of the big-time, really prestigious costume studios in New York, and after Karinska was no longer there, Barbara Matera was making a lot of the costumes for Broadway and major ballet companies. But so I'm going to just kind of show you what this quilted idea is. Not good for 30 core girls for a one-time show, but good to charge more money, and good for longevity, and good for the sugar plum fairy that your artistic director is expecting to last a lifetime. So what I've got is I have my cotillo lined up to a piece of horsehair canvas, and I am marking the center back. Some people call this tailor's pride or hair cloth. It just depends, but it's this itchy, scratchy, terrible stuff that on Project Runway they'll just use as lining. So what I've seen it more than once. They'll just stick it inside a thing and give the girl the itchiest dress you've ever seen. So it's itchy. I don't want it to go into the seam allowance, but let me cut out this little piece, and you can kind of see what I cut out. Now, when we do this for long-lasting things that cost a lot of money, we usually put the horsehair just at the top, right? I know, there's this itchy thing. What are you doing? But you can see, and anybody who's done tailoring, this will kind of look like some people call it a saddle on the back of a coat. There's like this weird shaped thing that goes over your shoulders. We're going to quilt a piece of horsehair into here to make the neck stop from growing, stretching out, and to keep this nice and flat up against her back. So the horsehair helps keep the top of the bodice nice and stiff while still letting her have a little more fluidity in other places. And I don't want it to go into the seam allowance, so you could actually even cut it a smidge smaller than your seam allowance. And I'm going to start with the horsehair on the side of my bodice that doesn't have a bone casing. And I am going to pin it down with a couple pins. So you can do this in front pieces too. In the old bodices I've never seen it on a side front or a middle front. It's usually like either side of the center front if you have like a nude insert in the front, and often in the back. And in Houston, we would often put this just in the backs because you have all that drama yanking people in and out of stuff. Then we're also going to cut a piece of satin to put into this scenario. So let me cut a piece of satin, and then shortly, Miss Rachel, we're going to go to this industrial machine over here. So I'm going to cut my satin. I'm going to start with it a little bit bigger, but this really this is a really nice finish for things. And Rick just made a Vivan Baird jacket where he did this in the backs and the front.
Yeah.
Yeah, he did it in kind of the front armhole and neck and down the front and in the backs, because it'll make it last a long, long, long time. So let me iron my little chunk here, and we're going to go to the machine. And you'll take more time doing this, but I just want to show you the idea. Oh, did I just melt that? Don't melt your lining. The iron has been sitting here cooking for a long time. It's a very old technique. And I think Parsons Mears, and they're in New York too, and probably Eric Winterling, if you buy a bodice for a costume, whether it's Elphaba and Wicked or whatever, they're going to do something like this. And it'll be easier for me to just start sewing it and then tell you what I'm doing. So actually, I should put on, would you grab me a spool of black thread? Thank you. So first I'm going to zigzag around the outside of my horsehair. And you don't want to yank on stuff. That's the biggest thing. We want to kind of treat it, even though we're going to put a lot of stitching on it, we still want to treat this like it's a delicate flower. Or in Italian, fiorellino. Who knows the Italian for little flower? I think it's fiorellino. I don't know why that just popped into my head. I think I was talking Poco fiorellino. You guys want to hear a funny story while I thread this machine? When I was in Italy a long time ago, my friend's parents, who speak no English, were so happy to have an American in their little village in Italy. And everywhere we went, they would announce to the whole restaurant that they have a homosexual Americano. And then I waited till like the last day of my month there to tell the mother what homosexual was in English, and she about hit the floor. She was so embarrassed. But it was a real memorable moment for me. Okay, so I'm making a little zigzag, and I'm going to zigzag this little piece of tailor's canvas around the edge first. Okay. Now I have a bone casing in there too that Rick is so nicely sewn in. So I have to skip over the bone casing. I'm going to skip over the bone casing. And if this were my hook side, I don't want all that bulk in the back. So if this were the hook side, I wouldn't run it behind the hooks. Okay? So now this edge that's normally going to grow pretty soon isn't going to grow over time, and you're going to have less of the back ripping. So now we are going to lay on this pretty piece of satin. I cut it with the shiny side.
Are you back stitching?
I didn't, because I'm just kind of holding it down, right? Actually, okay, I've got my satin facing the wrong way. Should I just cut another one? Nah, I know what I'm doing. So the satin side, you can get dull satin, shiny satin, thin satin. I wouldn't suggest getting something very thick because we're adding a layer of fabric, but we're adding a layer of fabric to add some longevity. Pins, please. Thing. So I'm just going to first baste around this thing. And the tension is a little off on my machine. Don't look at my zigzag. So now you're going to baste around this sucker. We call this impress your friends kind of sewing here. And I like to run off the edge when I'm basting stuff. Turning the corners I don't like. I think it's time for a new needle here. Okay, so all I've done is I've got this piece of horsehair stuck between my cotillion and my satin. And now, just where the horsehair is, or the whole piece, depending on how involved you want to get, I'm going to start quilting around. But I don't want to quilt over the bone casing, right? We want the bone casing to stay. I think I have a crafty bottom. I do. My bottom has a nick. So now I'm going to start quilting around this whole thing until I run out of thread. And I'm going to not quilt my bone casing closed, right? And then in a minute, I'll tell you kind of the other ways you can do this, because you just kind of have to like decide what's right for the fabric you chose and for what you're doing. So I'm not going to put any stitches that go into my seam allowance. I'm going to just stay inside the piece. And I'm going to just go around and round, quilting about 1/4 of an inch in. not closing my bone hole. Okay, so you hopefully can kind of see what I'm doing here. So here's my inside. Well, this is actually going to be what now goes against my fashion. The cotillo, the raw side of the cotillo is going to go against the fashion. But I filled in this section of horsehair really sturdy. In fact, there's hardly any bias left. Like I really have to pull to try to stretch that out. But down here around my waist and stuff, my bias is still acting like bias, but in the upper part of the back of this bodice where we want to keep this nice and flat, like fondant on an expensive wedding cake, that's what that quilting is going to do. Then you can have the nice satin side against the dancer's body, the shiny, more feel-good side. But now let's take it to the next step. Question about that? No, okay. So now, right? Now I know you're thinking, but you've added more thickness here. You've got cotillo. You would flatline this to your fashion, right? Let's just do that. Let me flatline this piece to fashion. Do I have a piece of fashion? Can I cut this out in my lap? I think so, right? So let me flatline this to a piece of something I should have ironed. So you're like, I know, he's not ironing because he wants to show us so much stuff. This is nice. This is going on a while too.
I love that stuff.
We like fabrics that are two colors. Okay, so now let's finish this off. So that first basting stitch now has become my stitching line. And match your grains up, do all that stuff that we already know. So now we're adding so much here. We have some lining, some cotillo, and the fashion. Take little bites. Don't stretch it out. So let me zip around this, and then I'll show you the next cool part of this. Actually, I'm going to just do two edges. Because you're smart folks. Now, let me get my huge scissors. It's the back of my head day, right? Like always. So now, right, my good seam allowance is on my cotillo, which I can see. So now I'm going to edit away what I don't need. I've worked with some different people that work lots of big movies, and the gentleman who made Queen Latifah's bodice in the musical Chicago, the TV musical, he used like 14 yards of gold brocade so that he could straighten out every single piece and deal with every piece in a square and get it sewn before he cut away to keep the grain line from getting pointy. But so let's look now, right? We have the inner piece of lining that we've quilted through, match your thread, and people will see this and go, that's so beautiful, wow. Then we have the piece of horsehair that doesn't go into the seam allowance. Then we have a piece of cotillo. Then we have our fashion. What's cool now is you can open up your lining and your fashion. And in the seam allowances, trim your cotillo down to like 1/8 of an inch, or even paint it if you want. So, So now we're cutting the cotillo totally out of the seam allowance. And then we just have a thin little bit of lining and our fashion fabric. So now we have the beefiness of the cotillo in our pattern piece, but we don't have the beefiness cotillion inside of our seam allowance. And put the shiny side towards the girl. I just cut mine out so fast that I wasn't paying attention. So are people getting kind of the idea? We just need one person to say, oh, wow. So now I have this super thin, flexible seam allowance. And I have left a smidge of cotillion to get caught to my next seam allowance so that I still have the sturdiness in the seam allowance, but the majority of my seam that's getting folded over is not full of cotillion. So then you would trim the cotillion out all the way around where you don't need cotillion and then serge it. Should I serge this? We get what I mean. Do I need to serge this edge? Then you would serge this edge.
Yes, got it.
Got it. So if you're making a group of things and you want them to last a long time, try this treatment just on the backs or an abridged, even quicker version of something like this. Then you have an extra layer of longevity in your back piece. And this quilting that we did, the cotillion through the horsehair in my inner lining, you could quilt this whole piece. And if you quilted this whole piece, it's just going to make it wear for a much, 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 much longer time. Like there's stuff that Karinska made in like the 1940s and 50s that looks the same as it did the first day. Yeah.
If you're adding embellishment to the fashion, would you do that before flatlining it?
Oh, yeah. Should we just look at that right now, too? Yes. So, depending on, whether you're slapping a piece of lace over it or you're incorporating elements like what Rachel is doing here, like she has all these spokes of ribbon and trim that she's working into this. Actually, it shows really good on here. If you were to do something like this, where you want to put trim or ribbons going up into a bodice, you could try this. I would say, and what Rachel's been doing, is to flatline one long side, right? And I pick my stitch out. Don't rip your stitches out like that. I ripped the fabric. So if you wanted to do something like this, you could flatline a long edge. Then you've got this whole operation going on that looks like this for whatever pattern piece or bodice piece it is. Then you just bring your trim and bits into it if you don't want them to go into the seam allowance. Anchor them on. So now you can see, you can mark where you're zigzagging this stuff on, and then go ahead and flatline the other side. Then on the inside, it stays nice and tidy. You don't have all this stitching where you put the other stuff on. I mean, the other way, if you're doing a whole piece, is to just stick whatever your fancy fabric is, your money fabric, right? You can also flatline that whole thing on. But one thing you've got to think about if you're just putting a piece of lace or something over the whole thing is, what does it feel like for that lace to get stuck in the seam allowance? And is it going to just torture the girl? If you're doing this, you might have to put a Shanghai seam. Why don't I just show you guys a Shanghai finish? Or a Hong Kong finish. It depends on who you're talking to. I don't think either of them are polite. Are they polite? Is that insensitive? It's not PC. But let's just talk a little bit more about this piece, and I want to show you how to do a Hong Kong finish or a Shanghai seam. So I'm going to cut this piece of lace out that's going to go on my back, right? So I'm going to show you how to make seam allowances that feel a little bit better. And I'm going to cut, there's a material called like nylon tricot. You could use souffle. There's a whole bunch of different kinds of fabrics. But let me just show you with one. I'll just use a piece of souffle. So you can make a Hong Kong or a Shanghai seam with anything that's sheer. Actually, you know what? Let me show it with a piece of satin. I'm going to show you with a piece of satin because it's going to show up better, but I wouldn't really recommend doing this like you'd want a really thin fabric, but I want to show you how to make Shanghai finish. Has anybody responded? Do they know the actual?
No.
Has anybody ever?
We're talking about this.
Oh, okay. You're just hanging out. If you look inside of a Chanel jacket, or at least an older Chanel jacket, you'll see this finish. And it's done to make the jacket have that kind of boucle fabric that they use, and kind of lined, but it's a way to finish off the seam so it feels nice against the lady. So I'm going to lay, I have a piece of bias, and I'm going to lay this to my whole process here, right? To everything I've got going on. And we're using bias because we need the flex. And in a little bit, I'm going to show you how to make the illusion of seam too. But we're just doing a really quick Hong Kong or Shanghai seam. It's a thing. I'm not making this up.
No,
We should grab the fold book and see what they call it. So now I have my stitching line. I'm going to stitch just like 1/8 of an inch outside my stitching line because I don't want this stuff to show inside the seam. You could even do a little bit less. Yeah.
Is this going to affect the seam thickness, or would you beat it down with a
We're gonna trim a bunch of stuff out so that we're not making a thick seam. But whenever you're doing something like this, remember you have to think about like where might I adjust something, right? I don't think. Okay, so I'm gonna just sew just outside my stitching line. I'm not back stitching yet.
Someone said they know it is Hong Kong, so.
We're going to say Hong Kong. I've heard it is both. From people in fashion and costume. So now, let's just kind of look. I can do the rest of this right. Oh no! I didn't watch what I was doing, you guys.
Hong Kong finish in the UK.
Hong Kong in the UK. There you go. So just kind of like...
Britex calls it Hong Kong.
Britex?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, then we're going to call it Hong Kong because they're fancy. I went off my line. I wasn't paying attention. So I'm stitching outside my seam. Trying not to make the same mistake. But go into Neiman Marcus and look at some really expensive clothing and you'll see this finish. So now I have this piece of bias here that I can fold over all of the crud in there. Or I can trim out a lot of my crud. Do I have this? So now, right, we just made this seam super, super, super thick. But I would go in now and trim out. So this is my piece of bias. I'm going to trim that short, and I am going to trim most of my shredsy lace, but I'm leaving some shredsy lace, because if I trim it too close, it's going to rip out, right? Again, this is not for every, this isn't for every costume, but it's for some of them. Then you can decide like how much more you want to trim out. I could also trim out some of my blue fashion or grade it away. I think in, it might be in the Simplicity Home Sewer's Guide, I think they might call this a wrap seam also. Just to keep things confusing. Now I don't want to clip into this really, but what I'm going to do now is I am going to fold this over, and I'm going to fold it over a second time and press it. And you can fold it and you can fold it a second time, but a second fold will make it thicker. And this goes back to the, like, we're just giving you, like, not 100% of a recipe, but we're just giving you options. So now I'm going to work my bias to the edge of the original seam allowance. Almost spilled my water. And give that a press. You'll probably want to put a couple pins in it. Do a neater job than I am. Now, I'm going to go back to the sewing machine and stitch my original stitching line again. So let's do that. Oh, the iron's gurgling.
We have a dying iron.
Our iron is on the way out. I have a few twists because I didn't spend enough time getting this perfect at the iron. But you could even, depending on if you think this is never getting altered on this seam, you could trim out almost all of your cut in the seam and then just use your bias to create your what's joining one piece to the next. Then you come back and you can paint this close. And there's more than one kind of way to do this. I'll look up in the books we've got and put up pictures of this process and see if they show any other versions.
Someone said they think it might also be called a bound seam.
Bound seam, that's it too, yep. Now, I've encased my nightmare fabric that's very painful. And then I just have this nice little piece of bias wrapped over my fashion to create my seam allowance. Then, when this joins together, it's this nice little piece of satiny stuff up against her skin instead of this painful piece of fabric. So, again, not good for always, but this is good for sometimes, and it's good for jackets and stuff. Or if you want to make something that's not heavily lined, but you want a nice finish on the inside. Now, let me show you another thing with this same piece before we move on. Have I lost anybody? So this bound seam isn't like an always thing. In fact, I've only done it like twice in ballet things. On men's stuff, actually. On some men's tunics that had brocade with lace over it, and I didn't want to just serge over the edge. I did the bound seam, and then I think what I did on the side seams was leave the nasty fabric over my sides with something to adjust, and then tacked a piece of thin, like bias cut cotton over the side seam so that the dancer didn't have to deal with all this itch. But let me show you another cool thing that we would do for leading things or stuff for like a big company that you think is going to get used a lot. If you picked a bodice fabric like I have, this blue stuff here, it's pretty thin and it's not going to last a long, long, long time. And in the backs of bodice, especially if there's tons of sharing, here's a quick thing you can do. Skip the quilting. You don't worry about your quilting. Don't make these bound seams. Again, I'm not telling everybody to make bound seams because that'll pop up in a thread on Facebook in a week and I will get phone calls and emails. But here's something really slick you can do. If this is the bar side of my bodice, and it is, so the hooks will be coming from the right over the left, just because that's how we do it. You don't have to do that. If this is the bar side of my bodice, what's going to happen over time from people pulling and abusing this is you're going to start to get little holes where the bars go, especially if you picked not the strongest fabric. What we did pretty much always with stuff I would cut at Houston and the Joffrey is we would take an extra piece of fashion and we would mark out where we think the bars are going to go. So I've got a piece of fashion and my flat lining, which has just become my pattern all this whole time, right? And I'm going to mark out on my extra piece of fabric where the bars are going to be put. So the bars are going to go into the underlap, right, across the center, and maybe an inch, inch and a half beyond center. And so I'm just using tracing paper to mark that shape. And I'm going to cut that shape out. And this, just adding this one step I'm showing you right now to a piece of coutil will help firm up your back without doing all the quilting and stuff. So I have this piece now, And you'll see I have cut it so that it is not running into my seam allowance. I've cut this piece shy of my seam allowance. So I have my lining. Don't worry about doing all the quilting stuff. Then I'm taking an extra piece of fashion, and I might quilt that around to my cotillion, and it's going to hide behind my fashion. So I've added an extra layer to beef it up over time, and I have not added thickness at the top and bottom because I cut it just a little short of my seam allowance, and you're going to stitch around that. That way, over time, when the hooks and bars are starting to get ripped, and they usually rip on the bar side. I've never seen the fashion rip badly on the hook side, but what's cool is over time, as the bars start to rip, and pretty soon, I know I've seen bodices that end up looking like this much of a train wreck with a row of bars. You have your patch already behind it. So you can just trim your fabric between your bars, fold over your nasty edge, and stitch that. Now your bar is still on, and you already have the matching fabric underneath. Some of the old, not the new, Houston just did a new nutcracker, but some of their old sugar plums were so funny because this process had happened, and all it did was reveal how beautiful the original pink fabric was and how horrible the outside fabric had become. So that's cool. It's like a self-patch, and it beefed it up.
Could you use interfacing instead?
Well, interfacing isn't giving you a self-patch for when the bars rip over time, but if you're not worried about the bars ripping over time, definitely run a strip of interfacing just inside the seam allowance on the back of your fashion. And let me see if we have any wiggin. Do we have any wiggin? Probably not. Let me tell everybody what that is. There's a fabulous product that's in the WAWAC or catalog or tailoring companies called Wiggin, and it's strips of 3 or 4 inch wide black or white bias interfacing. So it's just a roll of interfacing on a spool, and that's really good to put on the back side of your fashion.
Would you ever use that instead of horsehair?
Yeah, you could use interfacing in place of the horsehair. Like if you wanted to just cut a little shaped interfacing piece, you could even cut a little piece of interfacing that goes towards the upper back of your bodice piece. So cut an interfacing piece up here, and it goes down behind where your hooks and bars are, and stick that either to your fashion or to your cotillion or your twill, whatever you're using, and that will definitely help the longevity of things. And that little piece of interfacing will help the back stand up, you know, nice and erect over time. I said erect. Okay, let me show you. Are you ready for how we make stuff ultra super flat and tight? Yes. Some people in this class have seen me do this before, but it'll be new for others. I'm going to flatline a piece of glue, and we call this Moscow flatlining, or the Moscow scrunch.
You have one more question.
Yeah.
Iron-on interfacing or sewing?
Check your iron-on interfacing first. There's a brand of it that's not good for this kind of stuff. Hell-on interfacing is a brand, but their interfacing is usually, I think, not correct. Let me see. I just bought a roll. I'm coming back. Pretty much always, if you're interfacing a non-Halloween costume, look for woven interfacing where there's actually bias to the interfacing or a little bit of space between the fibers. That way, if you get a woven, if you get a woven interfacing, this is iron-on, it will bind to your fabric and act more like fabric because it has bias. I'm thinking of Pellon it's like just a flat sheet of white with glue on it, that stuff isn't very good. It's great for making witch hats, but not for costumes and clothes. That's a good description, right? It's good. Sponsored by Pellon. But Pellon may now make, we call this armor weft, but I know there's other names for it. But just see if your interfacing actually has bias. If you can pull your interfacing on the bias, then it's top notch. Let me show you this Moscow scratch now. And then we'll make a sleeve. What am I looking for? A piece of stuff that Rick made me. We're going to do it with a couple pieces. And we'll talk a little bit about bone placement at the same time. Let's talk just a little bit about why we put bones or we put bones, or where we don't put bones or we don't put bones. If you're starting to draft patterns, so here's our front, our middle front, our side front, side back, our nightmare back that I've been working on over here. Generally, if you've got, I'll backtrack. It sometimes depends on the company and what the girls are used to. It also depends on, can you train them to wear more boning? Because the spiral boning is very, very, very flexible. And I don't know how many times this would happen a lot at the Joffrey. I won't name names, but the girls would cut their bones out in the dressing room. And this stuff is so flexible that cutting it out doesn't really change the flexibility of their bodice, right? But it's hard to convince them of that. So what happens is they rip their bones out, and then they feel great.
That sounds gross.
And then they come to you the next night, and they say, my body is all wrinkly. And then you put the bones back in. So it's true.
Like it
happens all the time. So we generally, in a bodice, we will run a bone from the hem to the top. And you'll see on the Regal pattern, the bones aren't marked all the way up, but Rick is just so intuitive. He just did this anyways. Let's look at one of these pieces. So the bone is shown only going across kind of her midsection. So he ran his bone casing the whole way, and then you can't see it, but he stitched across 2 lines of stitching right where I put this pin. There's 2 lines of stitching closing that bone casing so that we can shove a bone in there and move with the girl a little bit and then decide if we think we'll lowering the bone helper or we'll raising the bone helper. So even though they're placed in there, know that if you leave the casing the whole way, you've got more options. Well, it's been a real training day, lots of trains. Then in this Regal bodice, it joins into the hip of the costume. So we're going to shove a bone in there just between my fingers and not shove the bone into the hip so that she's not so restricted down there. But you can bone as many or as little pieces as you desire, and the bones don't have to follow the grain line. I don't know why that is, but it works out for them not to always follow the grain line. So like here's my side front. This pattern we didn't bone the side front. The reason why in this pattern I chose not to add a bone there for the sole pattern is the hip section of this costume, the little hip down here, is joined to the tutu. So there's always something pulling this side front or side back down. The hip that joins in here is always pulling that down, helping to keep it flat. Now, if I didn't have this joined to the tutu, I might want to put a bone. And usually the side front and side back ones we run pretty diagonal. And I think a lot of bodice patterns have diagonal bones in them through history because it kind of gives you, anywhere you have something going from out to in, whether it's structure or design, is helping you keep that waist small. So you can bone every piece of a bodice, or you can say, you know what, this is a young girl and I have stiff fabric. I'm going to bone every other piece of the bodice. There's not really a ton of rules there, but we pulled out a Karinska book that has a couple darling bodices. This one is so cute on the left here. From the musical Joke, this tutu on the left, this is a Karinska tutu. They made this for, I think, New York City Ballet, the Joffrey, and I think Ballet Russe may have toured this. I don't know the ballet. But this tutu was at the Joffrey, one of them made by Karinska, and it actually just has 2 princess seams hidden by ribbon here, hidden by trim, and a center front. And some of these old ones just had a short bone from the waist to the under boob. And, you know, you can see it's loaded with wrinkles because it's older too. But also just know that the fewer, is that the right word? The fewer bones you have, the less structure you've got, the easier it is to move, but the more you're going to be fighting with wrinkles or bubbles. Or just make a spandex bodice and you're good to go. This is a good book, but hard to find. If you haven't seen or looked for this book on Amazon, it's just called Costumes by Karinska, and it's a really good reference for loads and loads and loads of historical costumes. In here you can even find kind of the evolution of Symphony and Scene and some other really timeless costumes. They were often cutting the entire side, front, and back on the bias and just having just princess seams in the front, and that was it. There's a swan on the left, and it's very simply put together. But in some of the Karinska bodices that are very simply put together, they were doing with an extra piece of cotton or twill some of the quilting to the lining on the inside to help hold this up and to help kind of keep the curve in the bust over time. And we, as history has gone on, the look of the bust has gotten more flat because I think the girls have gotten more flat. But this is a great book. But let's get to this Moscow scrunch. Did that kind of ask the boning question? I know 2 people emailed it. Hi, Canada. And it was asked at the beginning of the Bodice 1 class, too. So more bones, more structure. Less bones, less structure. But let's look now at this scrunch. We're going to do a Moscow scrunch and make a fake seam here with this beautiful blue that I think would make a darling blueberry. So this scrunch thing. This we do on leading ladies, or if we have a fabric that we think isn't going to stay nice and flat. So actually, first I should flatten my piece of fabric. How's everybody doing? Full of magic, Rick and Lydia? Good. Oh, I just spilled my water.
You have a couple people asking why there aren't bones on the seam.
You know, I've never boned a bodice on the seam. If you're going to bone on the seams, bone on the seams.
How do you close the bones that are only in the middle? Hand stitching?
Yeah, so if we call it a floating bone, we would slide it in the casing. So like on this one, if my bone is stopping, if it's not running all the way to the bottom, run your casing the whole way and then by hand stitch across the bottom.
What width of boning is that, and how do you cut spiral steel?
It's 1/4 inch boning, and like we said in Bodice 1, just take a piece of it to the hardware store and try it with different tools, because I think even here in our studio we all have a different preference as to what pliers we like to use. You know, successful, I find, looking at old bodices from different countries and different ballet companies, the bones that are put onto the seams where the bone is put into a casing, the seam is folded over lovely, and the bone is stitched on by hand, I think they work more successfully than where the bone casing is just slapped onto the seam. But we're always building in a way thinking that something may or may not be adjusted. So like this snow bodice that Rachel's working on, the bone casings are in between the seams so that if we have to take it in, we can actually take it in. And I think in a shop setting where you've got 20 people with rows of sewing machines making costumes like a factory, by having the bone in the center of the piece, it's faster to sew it, faster to alter it. And I think it gives you a flatter fit. Because if I go and sew a bone onto this seam, I'm actually going to foreshorten or lengthen the seam because you're trying to join the bone to an edge. Your seam allowance edge is not the same length as where it's actually hitting within the garment. Make sense? Makes sense. Right? But if you're doing that and it works, don't stop doing that. I just don't do it because I haven't done it. So let us show you the scrunch thing. So to do the scrunch, you first are going to identify where you think the nipple is, right? And we know where the waist is. So I'm going to start by penciling. I'm using Sharpie so it shows. You're going to identify where the nipple is. And you're going to pin right on the stitching line. So I'm going to pin at this, and I've lined my grain up. Bye! So I'm going to pin at my nipple, and I'm taking little bites right where the stitching is happening. Because if I pin not where the stitching is happening, I haven't anchored anything down in this semi-accurate process here. So I'm going to take little bites, and I want this nice and flat. Now, I want to get rid of what we call laddering or whiskers, and that's where your bodice, although you've sewn everything flat, and you don't have puckers, but you have these little pillows and bubbles, and it's usually across your midsection. So I pin my bust flat, and now I've got my waist drawn. I'm going to draw it really good. Now I'm going to go up 1/4 of an inch from my waist, and I'm going to draw 2 marks on my fashion fabric. So I have my waist. There it is. I've gone up 1/4 of an inch, and I've marked that 1/4 of an inch onto my fabric. You can't see it unless I zoom in. No. Does there?
Just so it's
yeah,
right.
yeah. So maybe if I hold it up like this, that'll keep it up. So I marked my waist, and then on my fabric, I marked a mark up 1/4 of an inch. So there's my waist, and on my fabric, I marked up. I'll say it 4 more times. 1/4 of an inch. Because this piece is pretty much straight. We're going to talk about something else on the bias. Now what I'm going to do, so you know how we were talking about bubbles on the outside versus bubbles on the inside? I'm going to push I'm pushing my cotillion up 1/4 of an inch and making a bubble on purpose. So I'm making a bubble in my cotillion. And now I am going to pin from the waist down with little bites on the stitching line. So this is stretched flat lining. Again, it takes lots more time, so I wouldn't do it if you're in the money-making business or unless this is for someone special or that needs to last a long time. So now I have a bubble. That shows. I have a bubble in my fashion. So now I'm going to center my bubble, and I'm going to keep splitting the difference of my bubble. He has a bubble. And I'm going to keep splitting it. So I'm going from side to side, splitting my bubble. So what is this making happen? It's making my fashion a smidge shorter than my lining. And once the bone goes in this and stretches it out, there's going to always be a little invisible tug from the top and bottom of my bodice, trying to get rid of those whiskers or the laddered effect going across the bodice. Okay, everybody's with me? Everybody's with me? So,
do you ever correct side to side?
Never, because I find when you stretch this up and down, it's enough to pull that out. And what happens, I know some makers that do side-to-side makers at an opera house, and what happens is if you did this the other way, I find, is before long, your seams, because your fashion is now shorter side to side, they're getting pulled apart and they're getting threadbare at the seam, because side to side, if you think of the bodice getting squished up and down, you're just squishing it down 1/4 of an inch. If you did every seam side to side, pretty soon your fashion, if you add it all up, is going to be quite small and your seams rip out. But if we even just flip this over, you can see when it's on the table, do a piece of this at home, you can already see before the bone that there's tension from the top to the bottom, and this wants to stay flatter longer. Yeah?
We have 2 questions.
Mm-hmm.
So you would do this to all the boned pieces?
Yeah, I do it to all the pieces with boning, and even pieces without boning, you can do it just a smidge. And then that said, if you have a really loosely woven brocade
That was the other question.
for your bodice fabric, you need to make a couple pieces and test it out. So for fabric A, you might be pushing it up 1/4 of an inch. For fabric B, you might be pushing it up 1/2 of an inch. Now let's talk about bias, because the bias is stretchier already, right? The bias is stretchier. So if this was my side front, if this, let's do another piece together and then we're going to sew one of them. If this is my side front, I'm matching my bias, right? I'm going to identify where I think her bust is, where her waist is. I am going to pin from my bust up. It's just a tiny little bit. And most of the bodice fabrics have a lot of bias in them. It just seems like we're all picking good brocades and twills and silks and stuff. So, but since this is already stretchier, I'm going to push my side up 3/8 of an inch or almost 1/2. And then what's wild, even though this doesn't even get a bone in this scenario, once I push this up and pin from your waist down, once I do that, I can already, look at that, I've already flattened out my fashion, and I push that up a whole 1/2 of an inch. And it's one of those things that I feel like pretty soon you just get a feel for it. Like when I do this for leading lady costumes, I don't sit here with a ruler and measure my push. I just kind of can feel how much bubble I need. Then we've shrunk our fashion fabric, so after she sweats in this, has lunch, wipes her hands, and partners, hopefully we have less wrinkle going on. So if you're making a bodice out of a fabric you're often using and it has a side piece on the bias, and you're always seeing wrinkles on the side, next time try scrunching it up a little bit more to see if you can continue to eliminate that desire for wrinkle. But we've eliminated the desire for some wrinkles. Yeah? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to sew. We're going to do 2 things next. And does anybody have questions about that process? Yes, I'm here for you.
Would that also be used for other things? Thinking of a lycra piece with stretchy lace on top. Would it work for that?
No, I don't think it really, well, right, lycra's its own beast. If I was making a lined leotard, I might do that the reverse because it's stretchy. If I was lining a leotard, I would make my lining on purpose a little bit smaller, or my inner layer a little bit smaller to kind of suck her in, push her in the right place, and then you have a little bit of room for your fashion. Let me show one more thing. Let me get a bucket. A bucket. Because some people, at some of the big opera companies, they call it pickle lining because they use a pickle bucket. So this is another version of the same idea. where you've got your pieces and your bucket. In the opera, you have usually larger pieces. Not always, Travis, be not. So at an opera house, or every maker is different, they'll cut their fashion a little bit closer to the size of their flat line. Then what they do is they lay their fashion over the flat lining. So they take at some opera houses, they'll lay their flat lining piece over a bucket, and then they will lay their fashion piece over, actually they lay it this way so that the fashion is shorter. So do you guys get what I mean by that the fashion is shorter? So by laying this up and down over a bucket, my cotillion piece will naturally be longer because it's on the top. Then you keep it on a bucket and pin it. Then when you open it up, you can feel that there's a little bit of stretch on the fashion. Tailors do stuff like this too sometimes, depending on a lapel or a collar or what it is they're trying to make. But the idea is there. We've lengthened the top of our lining, and the layer on the bucket will just be shorter because of the whirl. And then when we pull it up, there's a little bit of tension there too. We drape or pickle flat lining. The pickle method. So let me show you this now. This is another thing that we do a lot. I'm going to flatline this piece. So I want, with this stretched flat lining, I want the inside to have bubbles, because that means if there's an inside on the bubble, her skin, the bone, everything is trying to stretch that out, and then you end up having a much, much flatter bodice. Yeah. Spam call.
I've been getting calls from like other countries.
What? Okay, so let me show you this next thing, and then we're gonna bang a sleeve together, and we're gonna just show you the windshield in the imperial bodice, because I think everybody will get what that is when I show you. So we're gonna make the illusion of a seam, or what we call a decorative fold. So right, your bodice has so many pieces, and you want it to look more elaborate. Lots of folks will just cut their pattern and add more seams to it, but then you start to get like a million seams on the inside. It makes it thicker. It makes it more likely for something to get off. So we're going to make an illusion of a seam in this bodice that's kind of wide at the top on my front piece. So I'm drawing, you can use a pencil, I'm drawing where my illusion seam is going to go. And then I want my illusion seam to be flexible and easy to sew. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cut a piece of fashion to make my illusion here on the bias. So I'm cutting a second fabric. This we do have a handout for, and I will send this to everybody tomorrow. Look, it's just shreds. So now I want bias. So I'm going to cut a piece of fashion on the bias. So this is a decorative fold, or it's like crazy quilting, or we're making the illusion. We're making the illusion of a seam without putting more seams on the inside. So I'm gonna flat line around this, and I'm gonna flat line my faux seam, and then we are gonna put this piece of whatever this is onto here, and we're gonna make it look like our bodice has way more seams and beautiful things going on the outside without making the inside extra thick and complicated. So to the machine. Do I have my trimming scissors? So I've got my stretched flat lining, and the first thing I'm going to do is flat line around it, running off the edge. Some little scissors. And that scrunch in there will just lay flat. Those bubbles in your cotillion will just lay down as you sew across them. Then I'm going to put a couple pins in my faux seam, or my fake seam. So we're making an illusion seam. And I do have a handout we'll send everybody else. And I'm going to flatline that. Would you hand me a pin holder, please? Is there one up there? Okay, so I'm going to take my pins out. So now on the outside of my piece, I have a map, right? And on the inside, you can do this all with pencil and not with Sharpie like I did. And then, so right, this scrunched flat lining we just showed you. Experiment. You might scrunch more. Remember to scrunch bias on the bias. The bias you can scrunch more. And I have one other thing to say about it. And if you're doing this scrunch method and you don't put the bone from end to end, if the bone is not tight in there, then there's no reason to have done the scrunch if you're not putting a bone in there that's tight from edge to edge. Okay. So I flatlined my piece and I stitched my fake seam. Now what I'm going to do is work my bias alongside the fake seam. So does this even show, does the red show in there?
A little.
So you can kind of see it. It'll show more in a minute. But if I show you on the inside, this is my fake seam, this line. The sun just changed. There we go. This is my fake seam here. And I've stitched that through to the outside. So I want to go on the outside and right sides together. I want my piece of bias to just go over like a 1/4 inch past my fake seam. So this is a lot like crazy quilting. And then also sew and pin and think intuitively. Think ahead. This curve here is longer than this inside curve. I've got more guys in my marching band over here and they're closer together here. So I actually am going to ease my bias on somewhat so that when we fold this over, my outside edge also lays nice, okay? So I'm going to kind of pin over my fake seam, and I'm pushing a little bit of bias on as I go. I'm not just laying it down flat because I need more bias to get to my outside curve. Everybody take a rectangle of bias tonight and see if they can manipulate it until it lays in a perfect circle with no wrinkles. It can be done. So I'm just easing a little bit of bias on there, and then I'm going to sew it from the cotillion side with my line again. So now I'm going to sew that, my fake seam. Oh, I hope this works. And I'm always underneath with my hand checking to see what's going on too. You know, if I feel like there's a fold under there, there probably is. Okay, so now I've eased my little piece of bias on. And you can trim away the extra. And we'll send everybody a handout on this. And anybody that did not get a bodice or make a bodice selection, please email them to me. And also, I can't send you a pattern if you email me the age and social interests of your daughter. I've gotten a few of those, and I'm too literal. I can't figure it out. So then you can come back, and if you want, you can also trim away your fashion so that we're not making a super duper thick seam there. So I'm going to actually pull the basting out of my fashion, my original blue fashion. You could clip it so you're not yanking on the piece like I am. So we're adding interest without adding fullness. And you could grade this too. You could cut one a little bit longer to kind of make a nice transition in your seams. So now we're going to press this over and re-flatline it so we have the illusion of an extra seam. So it's a decorative fold, or it's a lot like some styles of crazy quilting. But there's more than one style of crazy quilting. So now, I am always editing away extra fabric. Like I started with this huge piece of bias. You can figure out what size you really need. But now I have a fake seam here. And I'm going to get that pressed nicely. We don't want lips. Then you're going to re-flatline that edge. Rachel, what do you think? Tomorrow, should we just make a video of making that sleeve for everybody to have forever and ever?
That'd be nice.
We're going to do that so that I can show you one other thing that I'd rather show you. We're going to just make the sleeve tomorrow, probably on Facebook Live or something, and we'll put it on the student page, but I'll send everybody the link because I know a few people were wanting to see that, and I want to make sure you see that. So let's go back to the table. Let's go back. Let's have some table. Oh, good. It's better with the sun. So see how cool is that? So do you guys kind of see what went on there? Does anybody have a question about that? Then if you re-flatline that, now when this joins our next piece, we have the illusion of a seam on the outside, adding more interest to our bodice without having another seam on the inside. And people have done some really cool stuff with this technique. No questions? Cool. So we'll send everybody the handout on that. Now, let's look at this windshield and thing, and then I also want to show you what we do when we add in a hip piece. So this is the back of the Imperial Bodice that is getting a built-in hip. So let's look at this. So we made, when we're doing a group of things, we make so many sizes that we're assuming that stuff doesn't need to be altered other than hooks and bars or the side seam or undoing the hooks to let more out in the back. So what I'm going to show you I wouldn't do if you think something is going to need more alterations. But what we like to do on the Regal Bodice, because it has that built-in little hip piece, and on the Imperial Bodice, we like to cut away the seam allowance of the hip piece. So I'm going to go, so Rachel has this gold hip with piping and the fashion and the coutil at the top. And you'll see the seam naturally wants to lay towards the hem. It wants to lay down. But it makes it pretty darn thick and uncomfortable for the dancer and thick on the outside. So we like to trim away, it's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, it's like 6 layers of fabric all right there. We like to trim away the pieces of the hip, the piece that's making the hip, and we like to trim away the piping. Not all of it. If you trim it too close, it'll just rip out. So I'm leaving a little more than an 1/8. And you can grade this also. So I'm trimming out some of the fabric from my hip and some of the fabric from my piping. And if you want this to lay even flatter, you can go in and trim out some of that fashion. So this costume is velvet with ribbons added in. I'm going to trim out like gimp trim. So now I'm going to grade out my fashion velvet so that I can lay the hip down really flat. But to make it lay really, really flat, I'm going to do a little press and hammer probably. I'll give that a little steam. So I cut out a lot of my thickness from the hip piece, so not the bottom of the bodice part, but from the hip. So I've cut out my hip, then I cut my piping a smidge longer. I cut out my fashion fabric. So all I've got here is coutil with a little. I've got coutil with a little bit of a hump. Then I like to go back with matching nice thread and cross stitch over that whole set of intersections so that my bodice is laying nice and flat on the inside and nice and flat on the outside. So what I did to the hip, does that make sense to everybody? Does anybody have a question about why I did that? Cut out all that extra and laid it down. So, boy, I'm struggling with the reverse image today. I should look on your monitor. So we're just cutting out a ton of thickness and fixing that. I'm going to show them the Mardi Gras bodice too before her. Can I get to it? I don't think I can get to it. It's up there. I bet I can get it while we take questions. I want to show you more use of that fold. And let me show you the windshield. Okay, let's see. I'm snooping on your question. So there's lots of different materials. Can we point, if we point you this way for the rest, is there, oh, it's worse. Try me over here. Hi.
Back up.
Back up.
Too close.
I'm too close. So let's look at what this windshield thing is. It's just a bagged piece of sheerish netting. This is a material that we're able to get in small batches. It's from a private person. This is called souffle, or some people know it as diamond souffle. It has a little bit of stretch one way and no stretch the other way, but it blends into lots of different seam allowances. Soon we might have 50 yards of it that we could lottery off or something. If we have excess, we'll let you know. But if everybody knows the Cher bodysuit that's covered in rhinestones that cover her front and bottom, and Britney Spears, they use a lot of souffle. But we cut, to make this windshield, we cut a piece of it with the stretch going one way on one piece, and then we cut a piece with the stretch going the other way. And then it's just cross-stitched, it's just matched the stitching line, and it's just cross-stitched down into the bodice, and it gives you somewhere to anchor stones or decorations and things. But it fits just like it's laid out on the pattern. And you can, if you bag it so you stitch around the top and the sides of it and leave the bottom open, then you can decide if you want to go back and put another stitch over your seam allowance, trim your seam allowance out so it disappears. And you can hook the strap to the top of it, or you can hook the strap to the bodice and then catch it to the little windshield thing. Yeah. Yeah. And then, from taking a quick yes, would a lot of people want some of this fabric if we tried to get more than 20 yards at a time? It's not cheap, and it doesn't work like stretch mesh, but it's good to have sometimes.
Yeah.
Yes, so we're going to explore that.
If we can't use souffle, would you use two-way stretch mesh?
You could use two-way stretch mesh and still bag it, but try to look for something that matches really well. Or you might use a single piece of stretch mesh and put like 1/8" elastic at the top and then fold it down just a little bit and stitch over it.
What is the slice in the pattern that looks like a dart?
A dart. That pattern has the windshield going far down into the bodice, so you just match the stitching line drawn on the bodice to the bottom stitching line on the windshield.
Could you explain what bagging means again?
Bagging is a real basic sewing term. Bagging is how you make a pillow. So if you make a pillowcase, you sew a long edge, sew a short edge, sew a long edge, and then turn it inside out. A good book that everybody, we helped some Australians get this, and we're not going to do it again and it wasn't the Australians, it was everybody else that didn't understand what we were trying to help with. Do you see it? The Vogue book?
Oh, the Vogue one?
Give me 2 seconds. I know it's here. Get the Vogue sewing book. I can't find mine. Maybe I emailed somebody.
Sitting somewhere.
I know, we're probably looking right at it. The Vogue sewing book from any decade is loaded with a lot of terms that come up in costuming and sewing and will help you be ultra successful. Ask a few questions, and I'm going to get down a bodice to show you a couple more things.
Those of you asking about the spelling, it's souffle, spelled like souffle.
Like souffle. Like nude, sometimes shops call it nude tricot. T-R-I-C-O-T. It's not really treacle either, but it's like something they could call it. It sounds right. I hoard it like gold, the simple.
Someone else has a good source for these different techniques. It's a book in the UK by Reader's Digest from the 70s that has all the techniques like bagging.
The older ones seem to have better explanations. And all those things that they, use in sewing, we're also using in costumes. I've had a few conversations with people where they think sewing clothes and sewing costumes are completely different. But if you look at sewing costumes and combine things from sewing clothes, your costumes will look better. Like earlier when we were talking about Pelon making a witch hat, Why can't I get this off? I'm struggling. Oh, it's pinned over the hands. I'll show you more of those folds, just because they're really good to see. Oh, sorry. I whacked her. Let's look at this bodice. And this is bagged stretch mesh shoulders. So this is stretch mesh that has been stitched together, serged together, and then turned inside out so that it has a nice edge on the edge. And then to put all these sequins on it, I stretched it as I was sewing so that the sequins don't pop off and every sequin is knotted on. But all of these seams, mostly, let's look at the front of this bodice. Does it show? From here to here is one piece of bodice with the illusion of a seam. This is just crazy quilted or folded over to make these bands. And even this little inset piece here in the bust, this is my pattern piece here. Then it's piped. Then a piece of bias is laid on and folded over, just like we did here. And that's where this little shard of green is coming from. So it's the illusion of a seam without having, you can see here where the seam is, the fake seam is because I stitched it, but there's not yet another seam on the inside. So that's all fake seams. We use this pattern for our Moulin Rouge class, and I think I could make it a pattern that we offer. It's just a nice generic thing. Another thing, this is from a different class and a different approach, is some old historic bodices will have a grosgrain tape that connects from the center back all the way across the bodice to the other center back. And that tape is often a 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch smaller than what the bodice measures. So this tape is stitched in at every seam intersection. And what that does is when it's on the girl, it makes it just a little bit tighter at their waist so the bodice doesn't have so much responsibility to squish in her waist. So that's something else you can play with. You'll see it a lot actually in strapless bridal wear, the tape. And that tape is smaller than where it hooks, so her waist is just squished in.
We have a lot of questions.
Yes, let's do questions. No, my face is so gross.
Back up. I'm so close to the camera.
My face is bad. The sun. How about right here?
Look at the camera.
Yeah.
I like the dragon creeping over you. Okay. So we're referring to your green and blue piece for somebody's questions.
Yeah.
If you wanted a different fashion at the top toward the bust and a different one at the bottom, would you
Same
use
thing.
the same?
Just figure out which one has the most real estate, sew that one down first, and then sew the other one on.
And then what is the green fabric?
I don't know. It's more polycrapulon. It's like a jacquard with a metallic thread in it.
And then referring to this.
Yeah.
Do you do that hand sewing on all the bodices you do?
We just do it on these seams that go over the hip.
But also the top.
Because on the top edge, we finish off the top edge with piping like we did in bodice 1. where we used, you can see it here, it's hiding. We finished off the top edge with the herringbone stitch, so our stitch doesn't show on the outside. We're just catching the piping and the cotillion, and that's the same stitch to finish off the hip, the bottom of the hip, and the top edge.
Could you use glissanet for your insert?
I don't even know what glissanet is. Yeah, is it like crystal sheet? If you think it doesn't,
It's like a sheer light.
we don't put. I choose to not put stretchy things in the middle of a bodice because I find when this is stretchy, my piece is here. The girl wants to hook it tighter and tighter. And pretty soon that's happening to your stretchy piece in the middle. Or double it. Or if you're putting a stretchy thing here, you can't make the back as tight as a professional dancer would request.
What does it mean on the sleeve on the regal where it says to bag the bottom and at the top? Are you doubling the entire sleeve?
Yeah, so we're going to make this one and put a video up. So if I was going to make the regal sleeve, I would take 2 fabrics that feel nice against my arm and cut the sleeve out with both fabrics and stick them together. Stick your 2 layers together. Then you bag, which means to connect an edge and leave a hole. You bag the top, bag the bottom, turn it inside out, and all your ugly seam is on the inside, and you can pinker serge it away. Then you stitch your casings into the sleeve. And we're going to make a video of making that sleeve tomorrow for everyone to have.
Someone said glissanet's a sheer stretch material that's 2-way stretch. And they were referring to that being the windshield. I don't know.
Yeah, you could use it up here. Like if the windshield is stretchy, I think that totally works. Yeah, I thought you meant the inset, like the little V. Usually don't make that stretchy if you're doing the little V.
Okay, not particular to bodices, but in the top plate class you talked about zigzagging over lace. Is that possible if there are beads in it? If so, how do you do it so they don't get stuck in the foot?
You just have to see what works.
It helps if you use that like darning foot.
Yeah, we use the free motion foot,
yeah,
which is, if you look up, it's a foot that has a hole in it, and it raises and lowers as you're sewing. So you can like sew towards a bead, go around a bead, travel down.
Kind of lift
the foot, yeah.
Someone has to use Petersham for that, and I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Petersham is the same, is old grosgrain ribbon. It's much better, but not everybody can get it. If your country has Petersham, it's really good to use as the tape on the inside. Again, that tape is if you feel like you want to try it out and use it.
How much smaller would the grosgrain be?
Smaller. You can play with, at least a 1/2 inch to 1 inch. But it depends too on how squishy your girl is,
Would you ever interface an entire panel of fashion fabric for a ballerina bodice?
If I felt I had to interface an entire fashion fabric for a panel of a ballerina bodice, I would pick a different fabric. That's a good answer, right?
They were talking about Petersham for the waist tape.
Yeah, Petersham would work too. Or Prussian tape.
I'm not sure. And the cross stitching, stop spraying too, so no need to serge. Oh, talking about the.
You can generally when we're cross stitching over an edge, sometimes we'll serge the edge of our piping, but the cross stitching encases it somewhat and acts kind of like a hand, like a blanket stitch in a way. And serging adds thickness, but it adds timeliness, so it's just kind of try both ways and make a choice.
Can you show a bodice with the back of with the hooks and bars on?
Yeah. Maybe.
You have that gold one laying around.
No, I took them off so that it would fit the dress form at the museum show.
Oh.
Remember? Yeah, we do. Hang on. Let me get the ladder. The green one.
Everyone can see you. If you have any other questions, go ahead and type them in about the last 2 classes.
This is a good one to look at the inside. This one is so pretty. Rachel made this one. Somebody started it. Rachel finished.
I think Brennan started it.
This is a sample from when we did Little Dancer for the Kennedy Center. Oh, this is a good one to look at. Oh, I'm way too close. So here's our bar side with 2 rows of bars put on by the machine. And then here's our hook side. Right, there's our hook side. There's a bone right next to it. And this actually was a sample we used in the class also. You can see that quilting, see the quilting in there? So this has just a thin piece of silk something and a piece of horsehair at the top so that we're not making this super duper thick all the way through. Yeah, you can see the cross stitching up here. There's the cross stitching, and this piece of bias is serged. So the front of this, you can see the front of this has quilting in it to make it last a long, long time. And the outside's just darling as can be. And you'll even see that this fake, the blouse on here, the blouse here is put on fake, kind of in a way like a fold back. It's just gathered, so there's not a seam running across the inside of the bodice. It's laid down and then applied on and flipped up and then finished up at the top edge. And this is our Degas bodice pattern, which is really shapely.
That's my favorite.
It kind of has an old-timey look.
On the bodice with the sequin shoulders, did you do the horizontal pieces the same way with bias?
These pieces, they are just actually tubes of lame stuck on before the seams were put on. So they're just floating right on top. But if a ballerina was going to wear this, I'd probably stitch them down or put a tack in it so that nobody's hand gets caught in here. Did I even show it?
Yeah,
I was just pretending like I was showing it.
Would you ever bag line a bodice or just use flat lining?
Just flat lining.
Well, it's sad when you say that.
Just flat lining.
Just boring old flat lining. Will you offer a coupon for patterns? I forgot to use my coupon after the tutu class.
Email me and say I forgot to use my coupon and tell me which pattern you would like.
I've seen tape for boning hand stitched with herringbone stitch into the inside of the bodice. Is this okay? It's
very pretty. It's kind of old-timey because the bone casing hadn't been produced until just a couple decades ago. So yes, that also works very well.
Will you offer patterns for those hats at any time in the future?
Those hats. The soldier hats?
I don't know.
They're just hats we're covering.
Do you ever think you'll cover romantic tutu skirts?
Oh yeah, we haven't done that. We could do that. Look at your face. Oh, I'm frozen.
It's only on mine.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Could you use smaller hooks and eyes than size 6?
Absolutely. Oh, did it quit?
No, it's just me. It's
Oh.
Okay. Would the black tape be helpful if you have a larger dancer, or would it make holding her in look more lumpy? Like
Just try it out. See, I like these vague answers.
For piping, does it matter if you use cotton or poly blend cord? Would one last longer than the other?
I think they both work.
You're the short.
I know.
I think yes.
Whatever you have.
Do what you feel.
I mean, I've piped with baling twine when we're out of pipe.
Don't say that. Did you quilt that before putting the bone casing on?
This one, the bone casings were put on, and then the quilting, I believe, is next to the bone casings. But you can do it in more than one order and get the same longevity.
How could I use the horsehair and quilting to fix a bodice?
I don't know. Send us a picture and a better explanation.
I would love to see a how-to on how to do that top ruffle technique. Probably that's on this.
On the bodice,
The
we can add something like that. We could just teach that whole bodice start to finish. It's a good one.
That's reminding you to get a prize tour.
Oh yeah, it's Nutcracker season, so that it's on the list.
And webinar day.
Yeah.
I thought waist tape was just to stop the bodice waist from stretching.
Yes, that's what we said, kind of. I mean,
And
yes,
so could it-
you're pinching her in a little bit and taking the responsibility off of the bodice. It used to be called a circus girdle in Victorian stretchwear.
Fun fact.
Fun fact.
What was the name of the pattern of the green and white bodice again?
That's our Degas pattern.
What brand of really spiky tracing wheel do you get?
That's from Richard the Thread, and it's called a Ponce wheel, P-O-N-C-E. Or is it P-O-U-N-C-E? It's one of those.
Where do you get your horsehair?
All our fabric stores sell it, so multiple places,
Yeah, we
local.
don't order it.
Tailor's cloth. If you want a bolt of it, get it from B. Black and Sons, but it's very expensive.
Will you be offering a tutu construction webinar soon? We just did
We
one.
did. So whoever that is, if you email us, you can buy the webinar, which is 3 parts, 3 days of 2 hours of tutu making, and there's also 1 day of embellishing. So email sewinstyle@hotmail.com and say what you're interested
Or
in.
message our Facebook page.
Yeah.
That's easier.
That's easier.
I
I need glasses.
could I take some hair from my horse's tail and use it?
Yes, that's what it used to be made out of. And I have one piece that's that old and it smells awful. Like a horse, like a wet horse and poop.
My violin bow.
That's how it's got its name.
Um,
And what's funny is they still color it to as if it were still made out of that, which is weird. It's nylon. This stuff is nylon. But they color it to try to make you feel like, oh yes, that's a horse mane and tail. Itchiest thing ever. Wow.
we have a request also for a class on the Degas.
Yeah, I think we could combine that into like a 2 or 3 day class.
I have not been able to get the ruche top onto the bodice I made when I was there. It's Maxine. When I was there, the Degas like green one. Any tips?
I lay right sides together with my gathered piece down facing her waist. And I usually pipe this edge. And I get that anchored on nice. Then I put it on a dress form. And I fold this up. And I don't assume that my stitching lines are going to match because my sheer fabric is woodgier. Then I address the sheer fabric at the neck and arm edges and get it to lay pleasing and then hook it down. So I don't necessarily try to match all my lines up. They're just like a guide.
How much gather is there?
I don't know. We usually do at least 2.5 to 3 times as much as an edge. I think that's it.
Looks like it. If you have any other questions, message our page.
And I think in the new year we'll do our round of patterning again. But anybody who's interested in patterning can also purchase those recordings. But once you take a patterning and practice it, you never have to buy a pattern again. Because like all the ruching and all that stuff comes right from patterning. Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.